Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I have another horror book review for you, and that is for The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle. This is a horror novella, actually, which I don't read a whole lot of novellas outside of H.P. Lovecraft, but I would like to get into some more of them sometime. And funnily enough, this book is actually a retelling of one of Lovecraft's short stories, specifically The Horror at Red Hook. This was an interesting one for me that I was really interested in because I had heard from like the Lovecraft community and a lot of other people in general in the horror community that this was a really good novella, but The Horror at Red Hook, both in my opinion and also seemingly in the general opinion of the Lovecraft community, is not looked upon super favorably. Personally, I found it extremely boring. Granted, I have not read it since I first read it some time ago. I've only read it once. I was going to reread it in preparation for reading this one, but I never got around to it. But I thought it was just very boring, and a lot of other people, it seems like, don't like it very much. Plus, The Horror at Red Hook is also pretty well known for being one of the Lovecraft stories that most overtly showed some of his racist views. For those who don't know, and if you know Lovecraft, you probably know this already, but he definitely had some racism issues going on. And that usually didn't come through super heavily in most of his stories, but in The Horror at Red Hook, it absolutely did. And so people look upon that story pretty unfavorably also for that reason. And so when I was looking into this book, it was like, okay, this kind of subverts some of those racist tendencies in the original story, and it retells that story in an interesting way. And so I was very interested in it, and I was hoping I would enjoy it, but I also was a little wary of it just because I didn't really like the original story that much. But this novella really impressed me. This is one of my favorite books that I've read so far this year, and it's a novella. It's like 150 pages, but it is one of my favorite books that I have read so far this year. I really, really enjoyed it. So to get started about this book, first thing I want to talk about in terms of positives, which is just a quick thing, I love the cover on this book. Like, that artwork is just amazing, and the font and everything, it looks really nice. I just had to point that out, but I love this cover artwork. It's so good. But first, I'm going to talk a bit about what this book's about, because I think that really is good. This book follows a character. It's split into two parts. The main character, you could say, of at least the first part of this book, but really the book in general, and the titular Black Tom, is a character named Tommy Tester, who is a black man living in New York City, specifically, I believe, in Harlem. And he is a musician, but he also deals in bringing things to people that, you know, might want to keep a little bit hush-hush, so to speak. And he gets involved in some stuff in this book with a character named Robert Suydam, I think is the name, who is this person who has kind of a very heavy interest in like occult stuff, which if you know Lovecraft, you know where that's probably headed. And so he gets involved in all of that. And then the second half of this book is the actual retelling of The Horror at Red Hook. The first half is basically all stuff leading up to that. And the second half is the retelling of the actual story, which follows Detective, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, Detective Malone, who runs into Tommy a handful of times earlier in the book, but then the second half is all from his perspective, and it's again basically the retelling of the actual Lovecraft story. So you get basically the background and kind of additional context to this version of that story, and then you get an actual full retelling, which even the names and everything are all the same. Like the locations, the names, you know, they actually go to Red Hook. Malone and Suydam both appear in the Lovecraft story, all that stuff. So it is very definitely a retelling. It's not just taking the story and putting new names on it. It's like an actual retelling. but it adds a lot more to it, which I really enjoyed. A lot of stuff in this book specifically related to that I really enjoyed, just adding more to that story. I think that the first half of this book, being from the perspective of Tommy, really helped the story a lot, because you get a lot of, the if it were just the second half, which again is basically what the original story was, I feel like the intrigue, it wouldn't quite be there. So you have the first half kind of setting everything up, which I thought was really excellent. And Tommy was a very interesting character as well. And one of the other things that this book adds on top of the original story, there's actually a handful of things. So like I said, the context, it adds some actual connections to the Cthulhu mythos, because the original story, as far as I can remember, did not have any. And I looked it up before I recorded this review, and from what I could see, there weren't any connections that I missed. So there are actual connections to Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos in this book. It also adds a lot heavier theming, because, like I said, the original story was a lot more racist. Basically, there's no nice way to put it. This book definitely does subvert that a lot. The one of the protagonists of the story is a black man. There's a lot of representation of non-white people in this book, and you definitely get a good sense of what it was like back when this story takes place. This takes place in the 1920s, and there's a lot of themes of race and racism at play, where people like the detective, who is a white cop, who acts in a way where he is definitely very prejudiced against Tommy and all the people around him. Other people, it's something that's brought up consistently. So you get a very good sense of that, which contributes then to the setting, which I think is the next thing I'll move on to. You really get a good sense of the setting of this book, the 1920s New York. It's very atmospheric. It's, for a book this short, it's, like I said, only 150 pages. It paints a very, very good picture of the setting, which I really enjoyed. And I would say that was something that, I was reading the book and I was really waiting for like the cosmic horror, Lovecraftian stuff to really get started. But despite that, all of the setting stuff really drew me in right from the beginning. So I was just hooked from the beginning, even because of what would, normally be considered the normal stuff of this story before it gets all cosmic and weird. The characters in this book were also really good. There's a handful of main characters. Like I said, you have Tommy, you have Soydam, and you have Detective Malone. There's also Ma-Ott, who appears a handful of times in this book, who is a somewhat more minor character, and you also have Tommy's father as well. Those are both probably somewhat more minor characters, but the three main players are Tommy, Soydam, and Detective Malone. And they're all very interesting. All the characters in this book are well done. They don't have a huge amount of development, but they have enough to be interesting. They all have unique personalities, unique voices, all that stuff. They're all very well done, and the character arc specifically that Tommy goes on during this book I really enjoyed. Which I can't really get into too much without spoiling the book, unfortunately, but his arc throughout this book I thought was really interesting. And the way that he ended up the way he did, again, going back to the themes of race in this book, he ends up in a very different place at the end of this book than he did at the beginning, which does involve, the cosmic horror stuff. And the way he ends up in that place because of the way that he was treated by other people, which is very interesting. More positive stuff about this book. The actual horror elements of this book, specifically the Lovecraftian horror, the cosmic horror, was done very well here. It is relatively minor, but it makes a big impact when it shows up. There's hints of it here and there throughout the book, and then it kind of becomes a little bit more prevalent towards the end of the book, as well as one scene maybe around halfway through the book. But it doesn't appear super often, but it makes, like I said, a big impact. And it was really interesting because I was wondering if this would actually have ties to the Cthulhu mythos, considering the original book didn't, the original story rather. Um, and this one did, and it was actually done really well. It was done very tastefully. It was done in a way that was very much, if you're a Lovecraft fan, you're gonna catch the connections very obviously. But it wasn't something where it was like, hey, look at this Lovecraftian thing that we're throwing into this book. Isn't that cool? It felt very appropriate. It felt very much in the vein that Lovecraft would have done, which is something I really appreciate. I feel like a lot of Lovecraftian media, I have not read a whole lot or seen like movies or anything very much outside of what H.P. Lovecraft wrote. I've read a few other short stories here and there that were inspired by his works, but I feel like Lovecraftian media has a reputation for being overly fan servicey when it comes to the Lovecraftian creatures and the gods and all that stuff. They go a little too hard on trying to do Lovecraft without really getting what made it, what it is. And I think this book really does get what made Lovecraft what it is, or what he was as a writer. So that was also done super well. And when the stuff actually starts happening towards the end of this book, like I got chills at a couple of points where it felt very impactful. I don't think there is a whole lot more for me to say about this book. As far as negatives, which I do have a couple of small nitpicks. First things first, the book does shift from one perspective to another about halfway through. Like I said, it switches from Tommy to Malone about halfway through. And I understand why that was done completely, and I think that's the best way that the author could have done that, because that's really the way that the story unfolds here. There's no way you could have actually stayed with Tommy's perspective at least all the way through. I think there maybe could have been a little bit more of him see a little bit more of the actual transformation, so to speak, that he goes through. Not literally, but just the, how he gets to the point where he is. You kind of see like up to maybe the 75% of his character arc, and then by the end he's at 100%, but you kind of miss that little bit in there. That might have been good to get. But the way that this book was written, it really couldn't have been done any other way, but it did feel slightly jarring to me at first, and it did take me out of the story just a little bit, where it was kind of having to switch gears in my brain to, okay, this is what the story is about now. But it was still done well, and I really did enjoy the second half of this book, and again, I don't think there's any other way it really could have been done. My only other issue with this book is that I wish it was longer, which is probably sounds more like a positive than a negative, and it probably is, because I got to the end of this book and I was like, man, I wish there was more. I wish that there was just, I enjoyed everything as it was, but I wish there was some more character development. I wish there was more setting. I wish there was a little bit more of the cosmic horror, all that stuff, which it was done super well. And like, I would rather have something like this where it's short, but it's concise and well done, rather than something that's overly bloated. So, I understand why it is this short, but I just wish there was a little bit more, because I just wanted to spend more time with this book and with these characters and with all the stuff going on, because I was just really into it and I just wanted more. Which, my feeling that I wish it was longer wasn't because I think it was underdeveloped. It's just that it left me wanting more, which I think is pretty good. I think either leaving your reader satisfied or wishing they could spend more time with your story, I think that's a good place to be in. So overall, in case you can't tell, I really loved this book. I thought it was excellent. It was as good as it was better than I expected, and as good as I hoped, I would say, because I had heard that it was amazing, but I tried to temper my expectations because I didn't love the original story and all that stuff. But it was really excellent, and I really enjoyed it a lot. I finished it very, very quickly, and I was reading this during my break at work earlier today, because I just finished this book today. I was reading it on my break, and my break was getting ready to end, and I was like 3/4 of the way through the book, and I was like, no, I just want to finish this book now. Why can't I just finish it? So like I was totally into it, and I loved this novella a whole lot. Would highly recommend it, especially if you're a Lovecraft fan. I think if you enjoy the tone and the vibe and just everything that Lovecraft did really well, I think you'll enjoy this book. As far as a rating out of 10 that I would give it a 9 or a 9.5. I would probably stick with a 9.5, I would say. Like I said, only thing that I really took an issue with this novella was that the transition from part 1 to part 2 was a little jarring, and that was literally it. I loved this book all the way through otherwise. So, let me know down in the comments if you have read The Ballad of Black Tom and what you thought of it. Also, how you think it compares to The Horror at Red Hook. Obviously, I think it's much better. I think that everything that this book added really enhanced that story a lot. And I think it was just a really great read in general. So, let me know your thoughts on this book down in the comments. And that is pretty much it for this video. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys next time.